Okay, so let me begin class here this morning just talking a little bit about your writing project and kind of where we're going to go this week with that. So I did get some emails from a few of you that you were kind of looking at topics, thinking about questions, identified a couple of papers, and that's all well and good. And as you begin to think about questions and you begin to think about paper topics and papers you want to talk about, by all means, send me an email and I'm happy to give you some brief feedback, right? It's better to send me an email and get some brief feedback from me than to spend a whole bunch of time finding papers on a topic that I don't think will work, or a topic that's too broad, or papers that really don't fit well together. So by all means, drop me a line. I'm happy to give you some brief feedback, even today. If you want to do that after class today, that would be great. So tomorrow, we will not have regular afternoon class. Instead, I'm going to meet with each of you in kind of 15-minute intervals or 15-minute meetings, and we will talk about where you are in the kind of process. And so basically, the two things I want to talk with you about in the meeting tomorrow are what is your question? And I want to make sure that we kind of fine tune our questions so that they're either not too broad, that there's like way too many papers to talk about, and they're not too narrow, meaning that we want you to have some things to talk about. Okay, so the main thing I want to talk about in this meeting tomorrow is make sure that we have, some semblance of a question, right? It may not be, completely fine-tuned, but I want us all by the end of, or I'm hoping that by the end of tomorrow, we'll all have a question, or at least, have a process by which we're going to have a question here in the next couple of days. And then I would be happy to talk with all of you about any potential articles or readings that you've identified that you want to use in your article, right? So I'm happy to kind of talk with you about what you might have found, or if I'm aware of some articles. For some of you, I very well might be aware of some papers or some articles or some books that might be useful for you to think about. And so those are going to be the two things that I talk with you each individually tomorrow, okay? And so, before tomorrow's class, before we meet individually tomorrow afternoon, I very much want everybody to at least have a possible question that they're going to be interested in, right? And then we'll work on fine tuning it and thinking a little bit about how we can have sources, okay? And then going forward, Friday is the next deadline for this. And that is, I want you to have a brief proposal together, okay? So I want you to have kind of an official paper proposal. And let me just say a couple words about what should be in this proposal. First, the proposal can be as little as a page, should not be longer than 2 pages. Okay, so it can be just 1 page, should not be longer than 2 pages. And in it, I would like you to just say a sentence or two about the following things. First off, what's your question and what's the relevance to class material? Okay, what's the question? What's the relevance to class material? Only need a couple of sentences on that, right? Once again, this is not your full paper, so you don't have to have a full introduction. There's a couple of sentences about what your question is and what's the relevance to class material. Then I would have liked you by that time to identify the articles you're going to use in your paper. And so for each article, give me a sentence or two summarizing the article and how it relates to the question that you're posing for your paper. Okay, so just a very brief summary. You can do longer than a couple of sentences, but once again, I'm not expecting a full-blown thing here. Just a very brief summary of the articles and how it relates to the question. And then the third thing I would like you to think about is how these articles fit together, right? If you can say a little bit about how you think these articles fit together, why you pick these articles, that would be useful to me. Okay, so that's going to be due Friday, right? And I think I'm going to make it due Friday morning. Okay, make it due Friday morning. So basically, after we meet, you'll have Wednesday and Thursday. Now, remember, Thursday's our exam. Maybe actually, now that I think about it, maybe I'll push back the due time to this to maybe Thursday or to Friday afternoon. So Thursday's our exam, but so I guess that's really a reason to begin working on this soon. Day and block plan. There's so much going on, but the reason why I want you to get your paper proposal to me on Friday is because I'm going to try to give you some quick feedback and get that back to you by Friday night or Saturday morning, so that then you have that to work on the paper over the weekend, right? So I know the weekends are a good time for many of you to work and you have a little bit more free time. So I want you to have some time over the weekend, because remember, the first draft of your paper is going to be due next Wednesday, right? I think that's what I have on the syllabus. So yeah, the block plan. It doesn't give us a lot of time to kind of sit around and sit around and think, right? We got to do. And so that's very much the approach we're going to take this week. Jordan, do you have a question?
Yeah. I was just wondering, when you say a first draft, like, what is your expectation? Like, how many pages, or like, do you expect the full thing to be done and then we just like revise it, or?
Well, okay, so that's a good question. I was going to actually talk about this later, but let me say something about this now. I am going to grade your final draft of this. Okay, so where I ultimately care is where you end up. Having said that, it's going to be your first draft that goes through peer review. Okay, so in other words, it's going to be your first draft that's going to be read by another member of the class. It's going to be your first draft that's read by me to give you feedback. And so if you have a really bad first draft, it's going to be hard for you to get the kind of feedback you need to, really have a good paper. And so what would I expect for a first draft? I mean, I really would expect the first draft to be 80% done, particularly in terms of content, right? Particularly in terms of the nuts and bolts content. I think I would really expect you to have, or I would hope that you'd have that done, because that's where you can get feedback. Okay, so I realize that might be a little ambitious and some of you might fall short of that. I think that's okay. But as I said, the better that you can make your first draft, the better your feedback will be, and the more you'll be posed to have a final draft that is really a finished product. So does that help? Okay. So this week is really really quite busy. We have our midterm on Thursday too, and I think I realize in many ways that should be kind of the primary focus this week, is on the midterm. I do not want this paper proposal to be a big responsibility for you, right? I mean, in the sense that my hope is that with a little bit of thinking and after meeting with me, we should all have a pretty good idea of what our question is going to be, and hopefully have some ideas about what some of the sources are going to be. So actually putting together the paper proposal, my hope is going to be pretty easy and pretty short. And then, I think the bulk of writing the paper, that time will have to come over the weekend and the beginning part of next week. The good thing is, just to give you a more heads up of kind of where we're headed in this class, the first couple of weeks, right up to Thursday, this class is more material intensive. But one of the things we're going to see next week is that we're going to be covering much less material, right? So there's going to be less reading. We'll spend a little bit less time in class, so that you're going to have more free time honestly, to be working on this paper as we kind of move towards a slightly more independent study mode of talking about this class. So just to keep that in mind, right? Those of you who are getting anxiety about how I'm going to get this done, there will be more time. There will be more time to work on your paper. So, I think if you can get, this week to focus on the exam on Thursday and to get that proposal together, that brief proposal together on Friday, if you're able to do that, then, I think writing the paper itself, you should have time to do that, right? Okay, any other questions? Because of the way my screen is set up, I can't always see all of you at the same time. So if I ever, here's a question in the chat. Are we going to have practice exam questions? Not really, but we will talk about the exam, right? We will talk about the exam as we get closer. But yeah, I mean, I'm not really going to put together a practice exam or anything like that, but we can talk about the exam as we get closer, and definitely we'll have a review session probably Wednesday afternoon if any of you have specific questions about the exam, okay? All right, anything else here before we jump into the... Okay, well, what are we talking about today? Today, I think, this is me, I'm biased, but I actually think that today's discussion, honestly, really today and tomorrow and Wednesday are some of the more interesting discussions, some of the more interesting topics that we'll talk about in this class. And in many ways, might actually give you some ideas for your paper, even though I realize this is really kind of late in the game. But in many ways, I think about what we talk about today and Tuesday and Wednesday is now we're really getting into the meat of the issue about why rich countries are rich and poor countries are poor, right? Last week, we talked about the Solow model. We kind of understand the framework for thinking about growth. We understand a couple of facts. We understand that there's a lot of disparity across the world, both in terms of levels of income and growth rates. We understand that there is both convergence and divergence going on across the globe. That it is true that some countries are catching up, but it is also true that many, many countries are falling behind. And I think another important thing that we understand is that concept of total factor productivity is absolutely crucial to understanding differences across countries, right? Differences in labor and human capital and physical capital, yes, they matter. But what really is the most important factor is total factor productivity. But here's the thing, we didn't really talk about what goes into that, right? Where is productivity coming down? Can we be more specific about what exactly impacts total factor productivity? And that's really what we're going to talk about the next 3 days leading up to your midterm, is what exactly is it that drives this kind of mysterious concept of total factor productivity, right? We know it's important, and yet we don't exactly know what it is. And we have not, to this point, really talked about where it comes from and why it's so different across countries. And so that's what really we're going to talk about here the next couple of days, right? That's what we're going to talk about the next couple of days. And so we begin that journey by talking about the Romer model. The Romer model is, really a model that's trying to explain where ideas come from and how ideas lead to growth. Before we get into the Romer model, though, I think we have to really back up here and think a little bit more carefully about what ideas are, and when we use the word technology, what do we mean by technology, all right? So first off, when I use the word technology, very clear that we're all understand that technology is actually a fairly broad idea, right? We think of technology as computers, right? And electric cars. But technology really is more than that. It is invention, but it's also innovation. And organization. So invention is the creation of a new idea for a new kind of process. Innovation is using existing ideas and existing processes in different ways. And organization is just that, right? How exactly we put the pieces together. So you think about Henry Ford's assembly line, right? Henry Ford really had the idea that instead of having the cars sit in one place and move the people around, let's put the people in one place and move the cars around. It doesn't sound like that radical idea, but it was a radical innovation, primarily based on organization, right? Primarily based on organization. And it had a huge increase in productivity, right? It allowed workers to produce much more if they didn't have to move around, but the cars moved to them. And so, we have to take a broad view of technology, right? Technology is not just the light bulb, right? It's a much broader idea than that. The key here, and the reason why we're going to find technology so important, is it doesn't suffer from diminishing margin returns. In the same way as capital does. So we'll talk later today. Innovation might suffer from diminishing margin returns, but it does not suffer from diminishing margin returns the same way that capital does. And that's what makes it so powerful. That's what makes it so potent in terms of increasing income levels, increasing growth rates. We're also going to use the word ideas a lot today. And what are ideas? Well, these are new technologies or innovations. The operative word here being ideas, being new, right? When we use the word ideas, we're really talking about new technology, new innovation. Ideas, of course, just like technology, can include things like organization, but it can include things like know-how. And know-how, I don't know if I have an exact definition for this, but know-how really has to do with this idea of learning by doing. Ideas often are associated with just instructions and recipes. And so many times when we think about technology, technology is just the accumulation of thousands and thousands of little ideas. Some of them purposely thought out, and some of them just kind of figured out as you go along. So I'm not going to talk about this too much, but I actually spent a good part of Saturday thinking about ideas when my 6-year-old is turning 7, and for his birthday, he wanted to go milk a cow. So we actually have a contact who runs a big dairy farm in Anamosa. So we went up to this dairy farm. For those of you who are from farming families or at all familiar with dairy farms, I am not. I grew up in a farming community, but it was not a dairy farming community. So really had never been to a dairy farm. It was actually quite fascinating to me to go up to this dairy farm. They have over 350 milking cows, which is I actually think it's the biggest operation in Iowa. And so it was, quite fascinating. You don't think about milking cows as a highly automated process, but it is. And, you know, if you just kind of look, look at the way that, you know, over the years, knowledge has been accumulated so that today, believe it or not, you get 3 times the amount of milk out of an average cow as we did in 1990, right? 3 times the amount of milk out of an average cow as we did in 1990. How in the world? By just 1,000 little things, right? 1,000 little things, such as, I don't know why this one jumped out at me, but the cows, when they like to sit down, having them sit in sand as opposed to our organic material, where organic material can actually breed bacteria and other sorts of things that can make the cow sick. Have them sit in sand. Who would have thought, right? But that had a dramatic improvement in the healthiness of cows, right? Thousands of these little things accumulated over time that lead to these big increases in productivity. And so, yeah, that's how it works, right? That's how it works. Thousands of little ideas accumulating over time to lead to big changes in productivity. And as we're going to see, it's those big changes in productivity then that lead to big changes in standard of living. Now, when we think about the economics of ideas, it can become quite complicated. And many of you have seen me, I do this in intermediate, but it kind of put this kind of flow chart here about ideas. And I want to talk about this flow chart again, maybe in a little bit different way than I talked about it in intermediate macro. But when you think about the ideas, the production of ideas, it leads to kind of a flow chart that leads to an important observation about how the economics of ideas has to be different from the models that we've talked about. First off, ideas are closely associated with the concept of non-rivalry. Non-rivalry with the concept of positive externalities. Positive externalities with the existence of fixed costs and increasing returns to scale. And fixed costs and increasing returns to scale with the idea of imperfect competition. So as we kind of talk through this, the conclusion we're going to come to is you cannot understand innovation and technology in a model of perfect competition. It becomes very difficult to understand purposeful innovation without thinking about imperfect competition. So let's talk about why that is. It all begins with this concept of non-rivalry. Non-rivalry means that everyone can use it. Right? One of the important concept of ideas is that everyone can use it without diminishing its use by others. Okay, so everyone can use an idea without diminishing its use by others. In part, it's because ideas often have this characteristic of intangibility, right? They're not physical things. They might be implemented using physical tools, but the idea itself is not a physical thing, right? So, you know, waffles are rivalrous. If I'm eating a waffle, you can't eat it either, right? So a lot of goods we think about in economics are rivalrous. I use it or you use it, but we can't both be using it. Ideas are non-rivalrous, right? Meaning that I can be using an idea and then you can use an idea. Thomas Jefferson compared, technology and innovation to the flame on a candle, right? He said, "He who receives an idea from me receives instruction himself without lessening mine, as he who lights his taper at mine receives light without darkening me," right? That's kind of the nature of ideas, right? They tend to spread. Now, another related to this idea of rivalry is the idea of whether a good is excludable or non-excludable. Okay. Excludable means you can prevent others from using it. And non-excludable, of course, means you can't prevent others from using it. So, while ideas tend to be non-rivalrous, that does not mean that you can't prevent other people from using it. You can make them excludable. And that, of course, is the purpose of a patent. All right, ideas are still non-rivalrous, but you can make them excludable. You can make them excludable. In economics, we have this concept of public goods. A public good is an idea that is, or something that is non-rivalrous and non-excludable, right? Meaning it's something that everybody can use and you can't prevent people from using it, or it's difficult to prevent people from using it. So if I can show you this figure here from your book. So I think this is a good way to kind of capture what's going on here. So here's just a table that helps us kind of think about where different goods fall on this matrix. So you have rivalrous goods and non-rivalrous goods. Rivalrous goods are things like services or a smartphone or to some extent fish in the sea, right? When I catch a fish, you can't catch that fish. And non-rivalrous goods are things like cable transmission, right? Or computer code or national defense or calculus. And so we can split goods based on whether they're rivalrous or non-rivalrous, but we can also split them based on how excludable they are, right? So for instance, cable TV is non-rivalrous. I can watch cable, but so can you, but it's also fairly excludable, meaning that it's pretty easy to make sure that if you don't want somebody watching your cable transmission, they can't watch it. On the flip side, national defense is much harder to be excludable, right? Because if I put a torpedo in my backyard or a missile in my backyard, it's hard for my neighbors not to enjoy some benefit from that or some cost, as the case might be, right? So, you can think about, goods here being non-rivalrous, but they can be excludable or they can't. A pure public good is one that really can't be excluded, right? And so things like national defense or basic research, right? Like calculus, right? You can't prevent people from learning calculus. What tends to be true about non-rivalrous goods that are not excludable, for instance, public goods, they tend to be underproduced in markets, right? And the reason is if everybody can use them, then nobody has an incentive to make them. And so we tend to think about this is a role for government. The role for government is to produce, one of the roles of government is to produce public goods, right? Goods that are non-rivalrous and not excludable. So ideas are non-rivalrous, But not all ideas are non-excludable. Some ideas are excludable, and those are particular patents. We're going to come back and talk later about patents. But you might already see that there are some benefits to patents and there's some cost to patents. The benefits of patents is by making an idea excludable, you give people an incentive to produce them, right? Because you basically are giving them a profit incentive. Once a good excludable, you can sell it. Of course, the bad thing about being excludable is that when you exclude people from using it, you're basically preventing them from using it at no cost to you, right? So you're basically preventing the use of ideas. Let's talk about, while we're on this topic, I'm going to not really kind of separate out our discussion of Easterly, right, in chapter 8. I'm going to kind of, as we go through, work in some things from that Easterly discussion. But Easterly talks a lot about leaks and matches. And I think this is fundamental to understanding ideas, right? Is ideas leak and they match. Why do they leak? What does Easterly mean by ideas leak?
That somebody creates them, but then other people adopt their practice.
Right. I mean, it's kind of a nicer way of saying non-rivalrous, right? That ideas are non-rivalrous. I can use it, you can use it. But just as importantly, ideas match, right? What does Easterly mean by match?
It's like people with high knowledge tends to like cooperate with other people who with high knowledge too.
Exactly, right? If I have an idea and Gao Ming Hao has an idea and they're related to each other, what happens when we get together? We can actually make each of our ideas more valuable, right? Because his idea can enhance the value of my idea can enhance the value of his, right? So when we talk about match, we're really talking about positive externalities, right? And we all know what a positive externality is. When there's benefits that accrue to somebody other than the buyer or seller, or in this case, somebody other than the holder of an idea. So ideas tend to create benefits for people around us. To put this in another way, what's the marginal benefit to society of an idea? It's greater than the benefit to the individual who creates the idea. So society gets, oh, I'm sorry, I'm writing and is that what the chat was? No, sorry about that. I forgot to switch over to my notes. Here you go. That's what I wrote, right? So the marginal benefit to society of an idea is greater than the marginal benefit to an individual of an idea. Or to say this in another way, ideas are all about networks. All about networks. And this is a fundamentally misunderstood aspect of ideas. Many people think that the history of technology is the story of solo genius. But it's not. It's really the history of networking, leaks, and matches. Most of the inventions of the 20th century, whether we're talking about germ theory, penicillin, radar, the personal computer, internet, were not the result of a single individual, but of groups of people working together. One idea feeding off somebody else's ideas in unexpected ways. Existing ideas being subtly improved upon, iteration after iteration, creating linkages that develop new technologies that not a single mind could have invented in isolation. That is the key to technology. Not a single mind could have invented most of our technology in isolation. It's all about networking. Interestingly, not all of this networking is driven by profits. Right? We're economists, we tend to think about profits as driving innovation, but not always. In fact, a lot of times, not at all. It's driven by other factors. So let me show you this. This figure here, if I can. Shoot, I gotta shrink this. I don't know how this is showing up. Can you see this whole? Shoot, let me see if I can shrink this. Okay, well, maybe this is a little too small for you to read. This is kind of awkwardly formatted, I apologize, but this is a matrix, right? Just like the matrix we looked at before. But here, the first column is whether it was made by an individual. The second column is whether it was made in a network. So an individual versus a network. Then the first row is whether it was created through markets, meaning profit-driven. And the second row, meaning it was not made in markets, but it was essentially driven by other factors, whether it's interest, whether it's academic interest, whether it's just kind of happenstance. And so what the author here, Steven Johnson, who's kind of a popular writer on technology, has done is he's taken modern innovations of the 20th century and put them into this matrix. And notice here, most of the inventions of the 20th century were non-market networked, right? In other words, not necessarily driven by profit motive, and certainly not created by a single individual, right? So you think about things like the periodic table, right? The idea of cosmic rays, vitamins, oral contraceptives, radar, GPS. All of this was developed by multiple people, oftentimes in academic contexts, not driven by profit, but driven by, academic interests. If you look up here at the ideas that were created by individuals and markets, there's relatively few of them, right? Most ideas are not created by individuals, and surprisingly, you see a lot more ideas created in network or created in the non-market sphere than in the market sphere. And so this just really illustrates the complicated economics of ideas, right? The complicated economics of ideas, that they're not always driven by profits. And so I want us to think about this, particularly when we come back and talk about patents, because the idea behind patents is that you need patents because it's the possibility of profits that drive most ideas. That's the assumption behind patents, that if you don't give people patents, they won't make ideas. But in fact, if you look at the 20th century, there are a lot of ideas that were not driven by profit. And so what do patents do? They actually prevent networking. And so there is a lot, I would say a lot of evidence that suggests that we way too broadly give out patents in the United States. In part because we have this idea that it's the profit motive that drives innovation, when in general, it's not, right? We'll come back to that later. All right. While we're talking about leaks and matches, it's also really important to talk about the problem of poverty traps. And we've talked about this before, but I think it's worth talking about again. The network that you're a part of determines your own individual productivity. You are not so much a product of your own productivity as you are a product of your network's productivity. (18) of the 20 poorest white majority counties in the United States are in Southeast Kentucky. How in the world do you explain something like that? That 18 of the 20 poorest white majority counties are all in one little area. And the other two are in West Virginia, bordering on those 18. So basically, we have one area of the country where almost all the white majority poor counties are. How do you explain that? It's the geography of growth, right? We know that rich and poor has a geographical basis, that poverty tends to be concentrated in certain areas, and that wealth tends to be concentrated in certain areas. When you begin to understand the power of leaks and matches, you begin to understand this. So as we've talked about before, if you're a poor person living in Southeast Kentucky and you've decided you're never going to leave Southeast Kentucky, then what's your incentive to get an education? Not much, right? Not much, because the network that you're in is not going to reward you for getting an education. In some sense, this is almost like coordination failure. I mean, it's not almost like, it is coordination failure. In the sense, if I don't get an education, then you don't have an incentive to get an education. And if you don't have an incentive to get an education, then I don't have an incentive, right? So if somehow we could both agree to go get an education, that would be great for both of us. But I can't make you do it and you can't make me do it. So we neither of us do it, right? And that's part of what happens in a poverty trap, right? This also explains a lot of migration. And the citizenship premium, which we've talked about many times, right? Why is it that somebody who migrates from the Congo to the United States instantly increases their income by a factor of 92? Very simple. When they were in Congo, they were part of one network. What happens when they move to the United States? They become part of another network that makes them much, much more productive. Now they get all of the positive externalities, right? This is all about the positive externalities of being in one place versus another. Finally, as we think about this, another implication of the ways that ideas leak and match is the the real existence of path independence. And by this, I mean initial conditions matter. Where you start determines where you end up. Okay, there is a historical reality that still impacts income today. People who think that history don't matter simply don't understand history, but they don't understand economics. History matters. And what has happened in the past still matters in the present. And so in so many discussions, right, whether we're talking about the impacts of slavery in the United States, whether we're talking about the impact of redlining in Chicago, those of you who are not familiar with redlining, this is basically the purposeful exclusion of people in certain areas in Chicago, particularly mixed race and minority neighborhoods, from being able to get financing to buy their houses, to 100 other topics, right? People who say, well, that was the past, this is today, don't understand economics. Because what did the past do? The past established networks. And these networks don't just come and go, but they evolve over time. And so if you start in a network that is low and disadvantaged, you are always going to be a product of that, right? And it also applies for privilege, right? If you're born into a network of privilege as an individual, either because of your skin color or because of your income level or because of the education of your parents or because of the area that you live in, you will continue to experience the benefit of that, right? So we're going to talk about this more tomorrow when we talk about a reading by Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson. Acemoglu, Robinson, Johnson, you're going to read this article. But when I tell you the premise of this article, at first it's kind of shocking. But Acemoglu, Robinson, and Johnson argue that how likely a white settler was to die in your country is a predictor of how rich you are today. Okay, let's say that again. How likely a white settler was to die in your country is a predictor of how rich you are today. So we're going to talk about why that would be, but it's an argument of path dependence, meaning what happened back in the 15 and 1600s still matters for why some people are rich and some people are poor, right? To give another example, some of you might be familiar with this book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, by Jared Diamond. In fact, for those of you who have not picked topics to write about, this is actually a really interesting book, and doing your literature review on this book would actually be not a bad question to pursue. But Guns, Germs, and Steel, Diamond is basically, I don't know what you call him. He's an anthropologist / scientist / linguist / medical doctor. I think he's got 3 or 4 PhDs. He's one of these crazy smart guys. But he basically kind of takes a broad view of history to answer the question, why is it that when Europeans met people from the Americas, that it was European culture and civilization that dominated? And so what Diamond argues was that Europe had some distinct ecological advantages over the Americas. Things such as, if you look at the species of animals that could be domesticated, I think of the 20 species of animals that are widely domesticated across the globe, 19 of them are from Europe. Only one, I believe, is from the Americas, the alpaca. And why is that? Well, it just appears sheer chance, It appears sheer chance, right? But the fact of the matter is that it gave Europeans and Euro-Asians, basically, a distinct advantage in terms of increasing their technology, right? And so he includes this. He looks at other things such as the ability to grow food and to increase the scale of production, and kind of traces out these original advantages that existed way back at the creation of human civilization, and say that these have really played themselves out so that when Columbus landed in America, right, they had distinct ecological advantages over the people there in terms of technology. Technology in terms of guns and steel, but also in terms of germs, right? And germs are a very important part of this because Europeans had animals that could be domesticated, they also had developed a lot of immunity to many germs. Most big germs or most big pandemics originate from animals, right? And so the fact that Europeans had spent more time working around domesticated animals actually gave them a lot more immunity that people in the Americas did not have when these cultures first came together. So there's a lot to say. I can't really give this book full justice in 2 minutes, other than to say that if you don't think that history matters, you're just not paying attention, right? And it matters in part because of all the way that technology evolves over time in terms of leaks and matches. And so, those of you who are still kind of struggling for a topic, looking at guns, germs, and steel might be an interesting one. I think the other interesting thing about this is it's more of a history book, right? So there's not a lot of complicated economics in it, for those of you who don't like economics. If you don't like economics, I don't know why you're in the class, but we all have to do what we have to do. Briefly, before we go to a break, let's finish up this discussion of the economics of ideas by talking about how all this relates to fixed costs and increasing returns to scale. Okay. When we take a more micro look at how ideas are produced, ideas only have to be produced once. After that, how much does it cost to spread an idea? About zero. But where do the costs to making idea almost always come from? They come up front. In other words, they're fixed costs. Almost all the cost of making idea comes before the idea is actually produced. After the idea is produced, ideas have very low cost to actually distribute, right? So what was I reading about the Moderna vaccine, right? That the Moderna vaccine cost about $500 million to create, but the cost of creating a vial is about $7, right? So almost all of the cost of this is right up front, right? Almost all of this is a lot right up front. And of course, there's a lot of risk associated with this, right? Because you really have to incur a lot of the costs even before you know you're going to have something that works. Together, this means that ideas have increasing returns to scale. And one way to think about increasing returns to scale is that the average cost of an idea is constantly falling, right? So if you look at a cost diagram and you think about quantity down here, and you think about average cost, because almost all of the cost is determined up front, if you just produced if an idea creates a product, like, for instance, let me give you a concrete example. Well, let's talk about the Moderna vaccine, right? What happens if you spent all that money and you produced one vial of the Moderna vaccine? Your cost would be $500 million. What happens if you produced 2 vials? $250 million. What happens if you produce 100 million vials? Now it's going to be like $5 or $6, right? In other words, the more you produce, the more that average cost is going to fall. Basically, what you're doing is you're spreading fixed costs across more units. You're spreading fixed costs across more units. What's then the implication of this? The implication of this is pretty clear. This is not a perfectly competitive market. This is imperfect competition. For every idea, there should be one producer. One producer, one idea, right? We shouldn't have companies making the same ideas over and over again because they're wasting all of those fixed costs. In the production of ideas, you're going to tend to have monopolists. Or if not monopolists, you're going to have monopolistic competition. And you are always going to have price greater than marginal cost. Because you're going to need profits to cover fixed costs. You need to generate profits to get these fixed costs covered. This is just the very nature of technology and innovation. The more that an industry is driven by technology and innovation, the more likely you are to have monopolists in it. So one of the big discussions today, of course, is, well, is Google a monopoly? Is Apple a monopoly? Is Facebook a monopoly? Of course they are, right? They're very close to being monopolies. I guess maybe the bigger question is, why are we surprised about that? I mean, that's the nature of technology and innovation. They tend to get dominated by monopolists. And so, yes, Google is a monopolist in many ways because of the economics of the markets that they operate, right? When you think about the advantage of using Google search engines, right? All of us use Google because there's huge advantages to having more and more people using the same search engine. There's also the advantage that Google is so profitable that it can reinvest money and spend all of this on fixed costs to create ideas that don't have a clear outcome always of how they're going to apply to markets. And so technology markets tend to get driven by monopolists. And so that's one of the things that, you know, we as a society have to deal with or grapple with. Do we want, you know, one company providing all of our search engine service? And if we don't, are we willing to pay the cost for that? Because the cost of that probably means less effective search engines and more money wasted on having 2 or 3 different search engines. Neither of them are good as the one we would have if we all use the same one. Right? So there is, like most things in economics, kind of a balancing of benefits and costs, right? Benefits and costs. Same for social media sites, right? There's big advantages of having everybody on Twitter, but then there are also some significant disadvantages of having everybody on Twitter that we have to balance. Really quickly, before I let you take a break, I know we're going a little late. just want to show you a couple of figures to just indicate how concentrated the creation of ideas are based on this idea of leaks and matches. So just show you a couple of things and then we'll take a break. First off, this is a graph that shows the city population on the horizontal axis and then the metro GDP per capita, how rich the city is. And one of the things we see is that bigger cities are richer cities. That's hard to explain using a Malthusian model, but it's very easy to explain when you think about the nature of ideas. Because what happens in bigger cities that have higher concentration of people? They create more ideas. And so the data suggests that a city that is 10 times larger creates 17 times more innovation. Right? I'll say that again. A city that's 10 times larger creates 17 times the amount of innovation. So there are big advantages to innovation, to living in a bigger city, in a more concentrated place. So where do you see most of the patents produced? If you look across the globe, most patent production is in big cities, right? The east and west coast of the United States, Europe, and then Asia, right? The coast, the southeastern coast of China, Japan, right? Those are the big hubs for innovation, or at least in terms of measured by patents. Here's kind of a shocking graph. This is looking at where college graduates lived in 1970, okay? Where college graduates lived in 1970. So white areas mean less college graduates live there. Dark areas mean more college graduates live there. This is 1970. What does this look like today? It's gotten almost completely white, right? Why? Because college graduates are leaving areas where there's not other college graduates. And where are they moving to? Regions where there were already college graduates. So what you see here is they're moving to big cities on the East Coast, West Coast, or in the center of the country, or college towns, right? I mean, so once again, ideas are highly concentrated, right? And that's attracting human capital. This also is a map of our voting behaviors, right? We know this, that what do we tend to see in counties that are more highly educated and richer? They tend to vote liberal or Democratic. In counties that are less educated and poor tend to vote Republican, right? This is a big schism in our politics. And so where does that schism result itself? In income, right? This is the US GDP broken up 50-50. The orange parts are half US GDP and the blue parts are the other half of GDP, right? That is just incredible economic inequality. And it just, just goes right back to what we've talked about, right? I mean, there's two Americas, right? There's an educated, richer America and a less educated, poorer America. And, it is largely split along geography in many ways. Here's looking at the world's top universities. And notice here that 18 of the top 20 universities are in the United States. Right? If there's one area where the U.S. Is at a significant advantage, is that it is in the quality of its higher education, right? Because it is a huge attraction of innovation and ideas and human capital, right? And so this is just a huge advantage for the United States, right? In many ways, this is, among the many advantages of the U.S., this is the biggest. And then this is really hard to read, but this is looking at an indicator of brain drain. How likely are people who are educated, how likely are they to stay in your country? And we can see that the US has the least problem with brain drain. And then we go down here at the bottom, you see countries like Russia, South Africa, India, right? China is closer to the bottom of this list than the top. Though that, of course, is changing in places like China and India. Yeah, you know, and why would an educated person stay in Russia? There's not a lot that's pulling them to stay in Russia. There's a lot that's pulling them to move out, right? Because they can get involved in bigger, more profitable networks. So that is the economics of ideas, right? Complicated, right? There's complicated. But one of the things we know is you have to move away from a model of perfect competition. The solo model is a model of perfect competition. And so explaining some of this stuff in the solo model is not really possible. We have to think about another model that can help us think about these ideas, and that's the Romer model, right? The Romer model is a version of the solo model in which companies can explicitly invest in the production of ideas, and those ideas can create growth. And so let's take a break here. Let's go take a break till 10:15. And then when we come back, we'll talk about the Romer model. All right, so that's what we'll do. So everybody enjoy a couple minutes, and we'll come back here at 10:15. All right, everyone. Okay, so let's talk about the Romer model. Once again, I think many of us, having been through intermediate macro, probably remember the Romer model to some extent. We're going to be talking about it a little bit differently than how we talk about an intermediate macro, but not that different, right? I think so. For hopefully a lot of us, this will jar up some memories that have been lurking in our subconscious here. So what's the Romer model? Really, what we're talking about is a model in which firms they can produce output, or they can choose to invest in ideas.
Oh, Professor?
Yeah.
Can you share the screen?
Yes, thank you. Thought I was. There we go. So a model in which firms can produce output or invest in ideas, and that these ideas are non-rivalrous. And these lead to increases in A, and they drive long-run growth. So unlike the solo model, this is an endogenous growth model. It's trying to explain where growth comes from. Where does growth come from? Well, because firms can produce ideas or produce output, or they can invest in ideas. Essentially, I should put this up here. You can think about this as research and development, right? So firms can spend their resources on producing more, or they can spend their resources on making new ideas, research and development. These ideas don't just help the individual firm, though, they help everybody, right? And so by helping everybody, they lead to aggregate growth. It leads to aggregate growth. So let's work through the assumptions here. And, I think one of the really interesting things about this model is really you don't have to change much from the solo model, right? That this really looks a lot like the solo model with just a couple of relatively modest changes. First, we have a production function, just as always. It looks very much like what we had in solo, but there is one important difference here. Instead of LT, let's think about LYT. So this is the labor that we devote to producing output. Because remember, not all of our labor is going to go into producing output now. Some of it is going to go into research and development. Then we have our capital evolution equation. This is the same as it was in Solo. Right? Same one that we had in Solo. No different here. So really, to this point, this is just the Solo model, right? Here's where we get something different. How do we produce ideas? Now we need a production function for ideas. Okay? So this is really the equation that's different, and this is the equation, to some extent, that's driving this whole thing. And so if you understand this equation, you're going to get what the Romer model is trying to tell us, okay? A dot, meaning new ideas, right? The change in technology is equal to Z bar which is just some exogenous factor. This is really kind of capturing any number of reasons why some countries might be better at creating R&D than other countries. LAT is labor devoted to research and development. So this is the labor that we do not put in output, but we devote to research and development. And then A. Having A on this side, how in the world do we justify higher A leads to higher A dot? Well, this is the big insight, right? If you have more ideas, you create more ideas. If you have more ideas, you create more ideas. It's that whole idea of positive externalities. Or spillovers. The more ideas you have, the more ideas you create. So if you remember on Friday, we talked about the Lucas model of human capital. And remember, we talked in that model that in the Lucas model, the more human capital you have, the more human capital you create. It's very much the same idea. Here, the more ideas you have, the more ideas you create, right? So basically, what's the biggest factor of creating ideas is having ideas, right? And I think there, this is the whole leaks and matches thing, right? This is really justified by that whole first hour discussion we had in class, right? That's really how we justify this equation. That's how Romer would justify this equation. Is this equation in a very simple way captures all of what we talked about in class about imperfect competition and positive externalities. Notice here there is a trade-off though. What happens if we spend more money on research and development? We're going to have less people to devote to output, right? And so the rest of this model is really just kind of closing it out. let's not have population growth in this model. Let's just assume that there's a labor supply that's fixed. Why? We're just keeping this constant. So if you spend more money on research and development, you're going to have less people to work in producing output. Can I back up a minute? There's something I meant to talk. I knew I was forgetting to say something about this equation, but I just want to say one more thing about this equation. You might notice there's something weird about this. It doesn't look like a production function because we don't have capital in here. Could we put capital in this production function? Sure. Honestly, it doesn't really change much in the model. And so as a result, your author has chosen not to put capital in this production function. Just keep it simple. But could you put capital in here? Absolutely, right? You could have the same choice that you devote some of your physical capital to producing output and some of your physical capital to producing ideas, right? So that's something that's relatively simple to the model. But just to keep things simple as possible, it's not in this model. Okay, and then the last thing that we need is what determines LAT, right? What determines how much that we spend on research and development? And we're just going to make that exogenous. Once again, to keep it simple. The economy devotes a constant fraction of the labor supply to research and development. And that's what L is. The constant fraction of the labor supply that's devoted to research and development. Could we make this endogenous and have a more complicated model in which firms choose how much to spend on research and development? Yes, you could. And in fact, in the regular Romer model, this is endogenous, meaning firms pick and choose how much they want to spend on research and development versus output. But that gets the model a little bit complicated. And so we're just going to keep things as simple as possible, right? But if this doesn't sound like a realistic assumption, yeah, it's not really. But in the interest of keeping things simple, we will just keep it as exogenous. So we have our endogenous and we have our exogenous variables here. And what are our endogenous? Y and A. Those things are endogenous. What's exogenous? Z, that productivity parameter, N, the labor supply, and L, little l, how much we devote to research and development. What's the solution to the model? Well, I'm just going to skip almost all this algebra because, quite honestly, it's the same solution that we had in Solo. The production function looks just like we had before. The y tilde is equal to k tilde alpha. It looks just the same. And what's the evolution of capital? The same equation. Except we don't have any n bar in this model. That's the same as before too, except we don't have any n bar because we assume that the population isn't growing. Once again, to keep things really simple. But here's the thing. What's G bar? G bar is the growth of A. And what's the growth of A? A dot A. And what's A dot A from our production function? We know this from our production function. If we plug in for LAT, that's what G bar is. So our growth of knowledge over time is a function of three things. That exogenous productivity parameter, Z, right? How good we are at making ideas. How much we spend on R&D. And then finally, our labor supply, N bar. So this model explains where growth comes from. It comes from spending on research and development. So just like before, what do we get here? If you look at the level of Y per capita output, it explodes over time. Or if you look at the log of Y, that should be a straight line. It's constantly growing over time. And what's Y dot Y? In other words, the growth rate of output, it's G. So there is a balanced growth path. So it's very much like the Solow model, except now we're explaining where A comes from. And A comes from those three things we talked about. Some sort of exogenous factors, how much we spend on research and development, and how much population we have. Okay, so let's talk about a couple of examples here of using the Romer model just to make sure that we understand some of the implications of it. What happens if, as a society, we begin to spend more on research and development? In other words, L bar goes up. We devote more people to research and development. So more people, you have to go get your PhD and go work at a university. And fewer of you get to go out and work. So let's think about this. And I'm not going to draw the solo diagram. Well, I guess I could draw the solo diagram, but I'm not going to do it here. I don't think we really need to get the intuition of what's going on. Okay, so here we are, where output is growing at a constant rate until this period of time. And it's at this period of time that L bar goes up. Okay. Who's feeling lucky that wants to help me think about this? What happens to the log of output?
Should go down, right?
Yeah, why do you say that, Max?
Because there's less people producing output and there's more people producing ideas.
Right. So in the short run, it's going to go down. But what should be true in the long run?
Should go up.
It should go up because now we're going to have faster growth in the long run. So in the short run, output goes down, but in the long run, we grow faster. So if I can draw this, if you think about what's happening here, it's going to look like that, right? Relative to actually, if I can, I'm going to erase this because I don't think I really drew that very well. It's going to grow faster in the long run, and then it's going to have a different slope, right? But that slope should get straightened out over time, right? It should become linear over time. So there's a trade-off here. You get less output in the short run, but in the long run, you grow faster. If we can think down to this bottom graph, how do we graph this? Well, now we know that the growth rate's going to go up in the long run, right? But what's the growth rate in the short run? Is it faster or slower than G prime? Jay says lower. But remember, this fall in output is just a one-time thing. It's not really a change in growth. Over the long run, if we have faster technology growth, we're going to need more capital. So part of what drives faster growth in the short run is the accumulation of capital. So if you think about what happens here, we actually have growth that's faster in the short run and then goes back to this new higher level of growth in the long run. So output falls initially a lot, but that's not really, that's like a one-time thing, not a growth thing, right? While output falls, there's actually an incentive to accumulate more capital in the long run. And so we have to grow faster to accumulate all that capital. That makes sense? So yeah, so this is a little bit, I guess one of the things I don't want you to lose track of here is that the Romer model really is so much the Solow model, right? We're just having a more realistic thinking about where A comes from. We're not making A completely exogenous, but we're trying to think a little bit more clearly about where A comes from. However, let's not fool ourselves. This is not the Solow model. To understand why this is different from the solo model, in one area where you get a completely different conclusion is what happens when there's a change in population. Let's talk about an increase in the population. If we remember from solo, this reduces per capita output. But what happens in Romer? If we have more people, what do we also get? More ideas. So what makes Romer different from solo when it comes to population is that when we get more people, we also get more ideas, and that leads to faster growth. So here we are going along. And then we have an increase in the population, right? Nobody at border security shows up for work one day and a bunch of people run into the country, okay? What happens? We begin to produce more ideas. We begin to grow faster. And so you might think about this is that initially per capita output would go down, right? Because we have all these new people. Initially per capita output's going to go down, but then we are going to grow faster in the long run. And likewise, just like we had before, because more people requires more capital, we actually grow faster initially, and then we go back to this new higher rate of output growth in the long run. This could not be more different than solo. This is a completely opposite conclusion from solo. Solo is Malthus, right? The more people you have, the poorer you are. Romer says the more people you have, the richer you are. Which one matches up with our experience? To me, it's Romer, right? We have more than 7 billion people living in the world today. What's true about average per capita income globally? It's higher than it's ever been before, right? So as we have more people, we have actually gotten richer, right? Likewise, think back to those graphs I showed you about more productive cities being richer and richer cities being bigger. We know that the richest areas of the world are the areas of the world where most people live. So, you know, no matter how you slice it, there appears to be this positive correlation between having more people and being richer. So I think the evidence points towards Romer and not solo, right? As we have more people, we actually create more ideas, right? More people means more ideas, means higher income. I think that is what we observe in the data, right? I just don't really think that there's much to argue about it. That's what we observe in the data. Let's talk about one other problem here. Not really even a problem, we're just something I want to talk about. Do we get convergence in the Romer model? We know in the solo model, we get conditional convergence. Are we going to get convergence in the Romer model? No. In fact, we get the exact opposite. Romer predicts divergence big time. The rich have higher A, and they, most importantly, they have higher G. So having more ideas means that you grow faster. Having more ideas means you create more new ideas. The rich will pull away from the poor. Is this happening? Well, we've talked about this a number of times. In some places, yes. If we're talking about the rich world versus sub-Saharan Africa, we see divergence. But in other places, no. For instance, we could think about most of Asia that is converging with the rich world. And why could that be? What do we think that our Romer model here is missing? Anybody have any ideas? What's the, you know, if we were going to change the Romer model to try to make it a little bit more realistic, what do you think we could add here to this model? I mean, you could argue that Asia is converging in part because they're spending more on research and development. That's actually not really supported by the data, but you could argue, well, maybe there's that. Anybody want to throw a Hail Mary? Well, you know, listen, I'll tell you, there's a lot of research on this, so you can look around. A lot of papers related to growth are actually asking this question. You know, how do we think about Asia? Why is Asia converging? What's happened to Asia that's allowed them to converge? And I think there's a number of factors that we could talk about, and we will talk about some of them tomorrow. But just one obvious factor that we could talk about right here is the phenomena of technology transfer. That this simple model of Romer has no ability for poor countries to use the technology of rich countries, right? So in other words, ideas only mix and match within their country. But in reality, there's leaks and matches across borders. And while this is not in the Romer model, you can imagine a model in which some countries can borrow the technology of other countries. How do they borrow it? They borrow it by sending some of their people to go study in rich countries. They borrow it through foreign investment, right? In other words, getting rich countries to set up factories and businesses in poor countries through global supply chains, right? And they do it through changing human capital, right? To actually learn through other countries. And so, you know, I think that's happened a lot, right? This has happened through migration, through global supply chains. through export promotion. Many countries in Asia have focused on models of goods that actually they can sell to abroad. They get involved in foreign markets in part as a way to learn and to taking a more outward orientation in terms of human capital. And so while this Romer model doesn't incorporate that, yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the things, among many, but one of the things that economists have talked about is that maybe the Romer model isn't so pessimistic about the ability of convergence. If you begin to think about the fact that technology isn't nearly as national as this Romer model makes it to be, right? Then in many sense, technology is global and that poor countries do get some advantage. This is actually, remember the Lucas model that we talked about on Friday, right? Lucas actually incorporates some of this. Remember that lambda, the possibility that your country starts growing? And what Lucas had was that lambda goes up as world income goes up. And so one way you can interpret that is higher world income creates more leaks and matches that everybody can enjoy. So to some extent, the Lucas model did include technology transfer, or you can imagine it including technology transfer, but that's not something that's in our simple Romer model, right? That's not something that's in our simple Romer model. Okay, I've gone over a little bit of time, so I'm gonna let you go here. Just a couple of things for this afternoon. This afternoon, I wanna take a little bit more of talk about the history of growth, right? So this afternoon, we won't add any more technical stuff, but I do wanna just talk a little bit about what the history of technology and innovation tells us about why some countries are rich and some countries are poor. So we'll do like a little history lesson. It won't be particularly long. I also wanted to remind you that the provost is giving a all-campus lecture from, was it 11:45 to 12? So it's just a 10 or 15-minute introduction. You all should have a Zoom link to that. If you don't, send me an email and I'll forward you the Zoom link. But you might want to come to that all-campus event if you haven't met Provost Crawford. She's a Cornell alum, just coming back this year, kind of in the middle, got dropped into the middle of the eye of the storm. But she's going to talk a little bit about, the future of higher education and a little bit, I'm sure, about being a Cornell grad. So anyway, just wanted to kind of remind you, for those of you who might find that interesting, it will only take 10 or 15 minutes of your time. So, okay, so we'll see you back here at 12:30. All right, enjoy your lunch.